The Warren-Matson Debate. Dr. Thomas B. Warren, Ph.D., is professor of the philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics at the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Wallace I. Matson, Ph.D., is professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. This debate was held at the Curtis-Hixson Convention Hall in Tampa, Florida, on September the 11th through the 14th, 1978. We present the Warren-Matson Debate on the existence of God. The propositions for this debate are as follows. The first proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God in the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does not exist. Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the affirmative, and Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the negative of this proposition. The second proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does exist. Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the affirmative, and Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the negative of this proposition. This production was directed and videotaped by Dr. Rex A. Turner, Jr. and by Dr. Curtis A. Cates, administrators and professors of the Alabama Christian School of Religion, Montgomery, Alabama. This film has been copyrighted and reproduced by the National Christian Press, Incorporated. Any reproductions, use, or sale of this film without written permission from the authorized representative of the National Christian Press is strictly prohibited.
I want to thank Dr. Warren for his many plugs for my book tonight and last night and perhaps to come. He continually harps, though, on my admission of fallibility, that I might have made a mistake in it somewhere, and this seems to content him. I think if he wants to talk about this subject at all, what he needs to do is show what howlers I did commit, not just keep saying over and over again that I said there might be some. I found that it's terribly dangerous to be undogmatic around Dr. Warren, but I'm afraid I can't change the habits of a lifetime, and I will just have to put up with it. Another thing I would want Dr. Warren to do is not just to keep crying contradiction, contradiction, but to show what proposition contradicts what other one. It certainly hasn't been clear to me in the cases that he's brought out, but perhaps I'm particularly stupid and everybody else gets it. Before I go on with my presentation, I suppose that since they're fairly well in our minds, I ought to take up some of the points that Dr. Warren made just now. I notice he says that Christianity is not and never has been anti-Semitic. Well, we would have to go into history about this, and it would be rather gruesome, so I'll let it pass. Though I'm afraid that it's all too easy to demonstrate the falsity of that assertion. He said furthermore that there's nothing anti-Semitic in any page of the Bible, though. When I had just read you the most anti-Semitic sentence ever written, I think there can be no doubt about it. By anti-Semitic, incidentally, I don't mean racial, I mean religious. So what Paul says about the Jews who are Christians is nothing to the point. He accuses me of being unscientific because I said that nothing would falsify my proposition, and he says that it's a doctrine of the philosophy that I'm supposed to espouse, that if nothing will falsify a proposition, it doesn't mean anything. He's overlooked a very significant exception of what I last night called lazy man's knowledge, or what the logicians call necessary truth, or self-contradictions. To repeat for, I haven't kept count, but it must be the 27th time at least, the proposition I am talking about is that God, and for the definition of God, I use Dr. Warren's definition, namely a being who is supremely good, powerful, and knowing. I know that God, the God of the New Testament, who punishes some souls eternally in hell, does not exist. And my claim is that to say of any being that he is good and that he inflicts eternal torment is to utter a contradiction. And consequently, the proposition that I'm defending is a necessary truth. That is, its denial is a self-contradiction. And consequently, no facts are even relevant to determining it. So there's no question about what might happen in the world as having any bearing on this. Just as nothing that happens or could conceivably happen in the world would have any bearing on whether 7 is 5 or 12, or whether triangles have 3 sides. This is a very elementary point in logic. I didn't think I would have to instruct Dr. Warren in it, but I hope that he's got it now. He says that I'm not debating the proposition. Well, I've just restated the proposition. I leave it to you to decide whether I've been debating it or not. Last night, Dr. Warren amazed us with the modus ponens and the disjunctive syllogism. Tonight it's God's ideal will and circumstantial will, but it will avail him nothing, as I shall now try to show. I have shown, and it's no big deal, it's what nearly everybody who has reflected on these matters has always known. I have shown that morals, the question of what's right and what's wrong, morals don't depend on the will and commandment of God any more than the multiplication table does. I might add that if they did, Dr. Warren would have to say that Aristotle, for example, had nothing to say, or wasn't entitled to say anything or something about ethics. Dr. Warren, I think, is a member of the American Philosophical Association, and I suppose one minimum qualification is knowing that the foundational book on ethics. Okay. In saying that ethics, the questions of what is right and wrong, don't depend on God's commandment, I'm not saying that if there is a good God and he does communicate commandments to us, these might not be very helpful to us. By the way, I better get this too. He did raise this point, I forgot. Dr. Warren continually mixes up what I was arguing about in my book and what I'm arguing about here. I'll make one last attempt to separate them. In my book, I was talking about the question of the existence of an infinitely powerful, knowing, good God. Period. In these debates, I'm talking about the question or generally talking about the question of an infinitely knowing, powerful, good God who eternally torments some people. Those are quite different, and they must not be confused. And what I have to say about one does not necessarily apply to the other. I can be, at least I can be agnostic to the extent of refusing to commit myself to the word no about the existence of the infinitely good, powerful, and knowing God. That, from that, much less is there any contradiction involved, if I don't put any restrictions at all or any hedges on asserting that I know this God who torments individuals eternally doesn't exist. By the way, maybe I haven't made this point before, I don't claim not to know that some being who eternally torments souls doesn't exist. At least in this moral argument, I do. I did give an argument last night, which didn't receive much discussion, to show that it's impossible because he couldn't torment me, at least. But I don't see any impossibility in principle of his tormenting some being that he created for the occasion. But then he wouldn't be, in my understanding of the term, God, he would be the devil. Actually, the charge that those who hold an eternity, who hold that God punishes eternally in hell, the charge that these people are devil worshippers, was made very early in the history of Christianity. I made a somewhat jocular remark the other night, or last night, or it was intended to be jocular, about Dr. Warren being the devil's advocate, but I'm afraid that I have to remake it, and not jocularly this time. All right. Well, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that there is a good God and he communicates commandments to us. These might be very helpful to us, and I haven't said anything that's incompatible with that. Just as it's helpful to the beginner in arithmetic to have a teacher to correct his problem sets. We're fallible mortals, or at least I am, and I can be wrong about these things, and if there is the infallible teacher to tell me, fine. That's why we have popes. Maybe we have God now too. But this is to be distinguished from the assertion that teacher is what makes the answer right. The arithmetic teacher isn't what makes 7 and 5, 12, though she may tell us that it's 12, and it may be news to us. All right, now to get on. If there were a good God, and he wanted us to be moral, we would be moral. It's as simple as that. Where God can do anything. But we're not moral, at least not all of us all the time. So God doesn't want us to be moral, at least not all of us all the time. An unappetizing conclusion, but one which the theist has to accept. This is the one that Dr. Warren tries to squirm out of with the ideal will and circumstantial will. But let me go on. Dr. Warren not only made these remarks just now, but he wrote a whole book trying to escape that fate. I'm afraid I will probably not repay the compliment by quoting very extensively, and I certainly haven't any slides from it, but I do want to refer to it. In that book, he points out rightly that omnipotence isn't compromised by inability to make a contradiction true. And he claims that it would involve contradiction to create moral agents who never sinned. But it's a good thing that there should be moral agents, so and so on. That is, since it's a good thing that there should be moral agents, but logically, if there are, they have to sin. Well, God has done the good thing in creating them. I don't have my own slideshow, but I guess this is on one of Dr. Warren's slides somewhere. I'll let him put it on when he wants to. There is evil, Dr. Warren admits in his book, but, he says, it is not evil that there is evil. I shall now show you why he can't squirm out of it this way. The rebuttal is quite simple. If a task really involves a contradiction, then it can never be accomplished, not even in one single instance. No one can draw even one four-sided triangle. Not even God could. But God has succeeded in creating some moral agents who were pretty good, the saints in heaven at least. Maybe not morally perfect, but that's not the demand. The demand is only that they be on the whole saintly and not give too much trouble. So, the task of creating a good moral agent is not a contradictory task, like drawing a four-sided triangle. No task that has been accomplished can be a self-contradictory task. I hope that's clear. And it's not even any big deal. I mentioned the saints in heaven, but there must be dozens of such moral agents right here in this hall at this very moment. But what God can do once or 12 times, He can do any number of times. So, there's no least shadow of contradiction in the notion of an earth entirely populated by saints. But I don't think that's what we have in fact. Do you? So, we're back with the old refrain. Either he wants to but can't, or he can but doesn't want to. Dr. Warren will say, indeed he has said, but what a moral agent does, he does freely. If God made only saints, they would be bogus. They wouldn't be doing their good works freely, but because they were wound up to mere robots. This rejoinder is confused in a complex way. I'll try to untangle it. For one thing, I don't think Dr. Warren wants to say that the 12 just men and women in the audience tonight are mere robots. Does he? Let him answer for himself. I don't think he wants to say that the saints in heaven were mere robots. I don't think he wants to say that he's a mere robot. But it's quite possible, because actual, that there should be a free, good, moral agent who is not a robot. So if there can be one, there can be 12, and if there are 12, there can be 12 billion. To go on, God, Dr. Warren admits, creates free moral agents. And the actions of free agents are their own. They're not programmed in by God. Okay, let's suppose that's so. But does God know what they're going to do before they do it? Before they're born, even? Dr. Warren can't deny that. I think he's already asserted it in this debate. So, God knew in advance that Adam would disobey, freely disobey. And God knew in advance that Judas Iscariot would freely betray his master. What then prevented God from just refraining from creating these bad eggs? Nothing at all, of course. If God is all-knowing, He can review the course of the life of every possible human being before He is created, and then abort the defective prospects. And if He can do this, He morally must do it, for the same kind of reason that builders have to submit their plans to the city building commission before they go ahead. God let loose Judas and Hitler on the world. It was in full knowledge of what they would do, and in possession of full power to prevent them from existing at all. So, Dr. Warren, we cannot let you or your God off the hook. And circumstantial will is not going to help the least bit. Dr. Warren says this world is not a place set up to provide fun for all of us all our lives. And I agree with him. Mere fun soon palls. We want to exert ourselves. Happiness, as my mentor Aristotle said, is virtuous activity. We even want to suffer. We're not necessarily masochists or other perverts in wanting to. We want to suffer in sports, explorations, great achievements of all sorts. Would it even be interesting to climb Mount Everest if there was no suffering involved. But all that's not evil, according to Dr. Warren. All that can be provided without any moral evil at all, any bad will. It logically could be provided, and what logic doesn't veto, God can do. Well, what is the world for? According to Dr. Warren, the world is to test souls. He calls it a veil of soul making, which I must say is a beautiful phrase, but I wonder what it means. God is interested in testing souls. But look at what a strange kind of test it is. God knows the results in advance. Dr. Warren can by any means deny that. So why have the tests? Wouldn't it be an insane aircraft engineer who knew by his calculations already which of his planes would perform okay and which would fall apart in the air, killing the test pilots and innumerable school children on the ground, but who went ahead and sent them all up just the same? Dr. Warren, when you design aircraft, you go back to the drawing board when your model fails in the wind tunnel. And the procedure that a mere human engineer can follow, and is indeed morally obligated to follow, can certainly be followed by omnipotence. And I repeat, in case you missed the point, that it is nothing to the case to say that the aircraft is a mere machine while the human being is a free moral agent. The analogy is perfectly valid in the relevant respect, which is that both engineer and God know in advance what is going to happen if this contraption gets off the ground. So, God, if he is omniscient and omnipotent, and yet creates sinners, is not, logically cannot be good. So, God, as Dr. Warren defines him, does not exist because he logically cannot exist. QED, for the 17th time. This is so, even if all that is attributed to God is the creation of the people we find around us in the world. But God, Dr. Warren's God, remember, is a lot worse than that, because he goes ahead and punishes the ones that don't pan out. I will take that question up, a very interesting one, I hope, in my third 20-minute period. Thank you.
Let's now take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll return for resumption of discussion. Here, I'm going to ask both of our debaters, if they will, to be aware of the fact that the lapel mic is simply for the taping, and that the auditorium mics are the two larger ones, and if you back away from it or get under them, I've lowered them some. It may be very difficult for the audience to hear. And court reporters are saying they could not hear, but they are now at this time. Are people in the back able to hear better now? The sound seems to be better. I can't see whether you can or not. Maybe it's better. If someone in the back will be sensitive to the sound, and if it is still not doing as it should, and you cannot hear as you ought,
Dr. Matson, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be before you again for this second speech of the discussion this evening. I appreciated in some ways Dr. Matson's speech. I think, as I indicated before, he's warmed up to his task a little more, and I think that's helping to make the discussion a little more what it ought to be. I want to begin with just a point or two here in his speech before I continue along the line of thought. I've arranged to show you that every point that he brings is really a failure to establish the proposition which he's obligated himself to affirm and to prove. He has asked that I give him something in writing that shows these contradictions which I have been claiming. You've noticed that he's claimed time and again that I have been guilty of contradictions, but he's never handed me anything that I'm aware of. I wonder, Dr. Matson, why you insist on seeing it written when you yourself are not supplying it written, but I'm glad to supply you this written statement from the tapes last evening. From your first affirmative, I am not out to make converts. In fact, I'd be a little embarrassed about it because I must remember that after all, I might just possibly be wrong, in which case I'd be damning him to hell, wouldn't I? You know, as Dr. Matson said, that it's very dangerous to be dogmatic around Dr. Warren. No, it isn't, Dr. Matson. It's just when you sign propositions that say, I know that something's the case, and then you start saying that you don't know it, that it becomes dangerous to be undogmatic. You see, when you sign a proposition that says, I know something, that means that you're saying, I cannot be wrong about it. Now, notice what you said in the second speech. That is last evening. I can assert that that being, that is the being of your proposition, does not exist, cannot exist, couldn't possibly exist. I cannot possibly be mistaken about it. On that issue, I'm a complete atheist, and I'm not apologizing, retreating, hedging, waffling, or anything. Is that perfectly clear? So you see, he said he might possibly be wrong about his proposition, and there it is in writing, Dr. Matson. And then he said that he couldn't possibly be wrong about it. Then he said, and here's another contradiction, he said murder is not wrong because it's against any law, and then later he stated the difference between murder and killing is, murder is unlawful killing. And there it is in writing, Dr. Matson. Then he keeps telling us that evil is pointless suffering, and some suffering has a point, but he never really gets around to telling us. My friends, we've been subjected to sheer subjectivism. Again and again, the only thing that he says about it is, can't you see that? Can't you just hear Hitler and Himmler saying, why can't you see that this is the thing to do? To destroy the Jews? They have exactly the same sort of reason that Dr. Matson has. That's the one and only thing that he's offered as an alleged support for the proposition which he's given. Can't you just see it's wrong? Let's look at the propositions that I've indicated that starting with this 68. I want you to notice here as the Nazis were accused in the trials following World War II for the heinous crimes that were committed at Auschwitz and Belgium and other places. Their defense was this: our society had its own needs and desires. Our society made its own laws based on those needs and desires. Our society commanded us to exterminate the Jews. It would have been wrong for us not to have obeyed. Now you try to condemn us by the law of an alien society, a value system which had nothing to do with the Nazis. Now you can see the devil's advocate tonight is not on the right side of the stand, but on the left, because there is exactly the defense that Dr. Wallace I. Matson has given for his position. Don't you see? You can see that it's right. There is no objective reference. There isn't anything you can refer to say that this fits it. There isn't anything that you can say, I'm going away from it or I'm coming back to it. You just make a cry, can't you see? Here they had their own laws, we needed it, can't you see that it's right? You do not have the right to say that we have done wrong. But notice the prosecutors, the accusers said they appealed to a higher law which rises above the provincial and the transient. In other words, what some nation or some individual may decide is right is simply not the basis. One individual may decide that murder is right, another may decide that it's wrong, one may decide adultery is right, another is wrong. Both can be right given atheism. And you can stay here until 100 years will pass, and this man nor any of his colleagues will ever be able to say anything to the contrary to show that he is not guilty of mere subjectivism, that and nothing else. Subjectivism implies a logical contradiction. The Nazis could say they're right, the communists can say they're right, anyone who opposes them say they're right, and cry, can't you see that it's right? You can see that, but no basis whatever given for it, no objective standard or reference. All right, that takes care of what he has said along that line. Dr. Matson, as you said, let's don't hear any more about that. All right, now let's look at chart 84 and 8. Reasons for punishment. You can't really understand this argument from evil as the atheists give it. You can't understand the truth about it and understand how to reply to what they're saying unless you understand the reasons for it. As I indicated before, it is not difficult to see from the things about us, even from our own bodies, from our own beings, that God, the infinite being, is self-existent, exists. But when one raises an objection, but he cannot exist because a contradiction exists. Because if you claim that he's good and yet he punishes somebody, even if you slap him on the wrist, that would prove to be a self-contradiction, and he cannot exist. He cannot punish evil. He may be good and loving, but he cannot be holy and righteous. But now let us look that men suffer for various reasons. For example, God has made this world to be inhabited, Isaiah 45. God made it for a purpose. It didn't just happen. You notice how Dr. Matson has wanted to stay completely away from the eternality of matter, from life coming from non-life, posing as if that were merely my problem. But Dr. Matson, it is your problem. You're the one who must explain the eternality of matter and how life came from non-life, when in your book you have said that spontaneous generation simply does not occur, that no life comes except from seed. Therefore, evolution is false, and if evolution is false, atheism is false. Will you please tell us how the first living things got here if evolution is not true? Now let us notice that we suffer in this life because sometimes of our own sin, and because sometimes of ignorance or carelessness, sometimes of the sins of others. But if God, who is infinite in goodness, punishes men, for what reason does he do so? I want to be talking now about God's punishing man and his warnings concerning that punishment. First of all, I suggest deterrence. Stated, first of all, God warns man of punishment and actually punishes them in order to deter them from sin and or from further sin. God warned man that if he ate of the tree that was in the midst of the garden, which he'd instructed them not to eat, that they would surely die. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 13 warns against men falling away. Deuteronomy 11, 26 and 28, and on and on and on through the Bible. God warns man of the consequences of living a life of disobedience or of falling into sin. And then there is the matter of reformation, of changing a man after he has fallen into sin. Stated, first of all, God warns man of punishment and actually punishes them in order to lead them to reform their lives. We see this in Matthew 3, verses 1 to 11, Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 to 7, where he wrote to the church at Ephesus. It had left its first love. Here is a warning from the sacred scriptures that you must repent or else there will be punishment. On and on and on we could go. The Bible is simply filled with passages of this kind. Reformation, then, God warns man of punishment and actually punishes them to lead them to reform their lives. When men fall into sin, God still loves them. God doesn't want anybody to perish. He doesn't even want Wallace-Matson to perish, in spite of the way he's talking in this debate. If he were to repent, God would receive him in loving arms if he'd obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. As we find this in Numbers 13 and 14, where Israel in disobedience turned back away from the way God would have them to go. But the men who were faithful, God carried on into the land. Revelation 2 and 3, where God warns various churches having already fallen into sin. And then here's the matter of retribution, of what sin actually deserves. I want you to consider, among other things, the evil of atheism, what it's doing to our nation, what it's doing to the world. The very heart and core of communism is atheism. It holds that nothing exists but materialism. There is no God, there is no spirit. They, in consistency with that position, say there is no absolute good, there is no absolute evil. Good is whatever advances the predictions of the dialectic, whatever then advances communism. They are more honest in their position than is Dr. Matson, who tries to hold hands with both sides and to say there is no God, and yet to say there is absolute truth and there is absolute good and evil. Dr. Matson needs to take a lesson from the communists and the communist humanism and recognize that they are being honest and forthright in recognizing the logical consequence of that doctrine. But what does man deserve because of sin? And how would he possibly know? If there is a great eternal God, and if he does have a law, an instruction which he's given to man, if the Bible really is the Word of God, as it warns that man must live in obedience with it, how would Wallace Matson possibly know what ought to be the punishment for sin? No one could possibly know unless God would tell us. And he tells us in two basic ways. The way of the price to get out of it, the price of the Son of God. You could not do it by the blood of bulls and goats, Hebrews 10:4, but you must do it by blood, and only by the blood of Christ, Ephesians 1:7. You can know the heinousness of sin by knowing the price it takes to get out of it, and what will be the punishment if you live and die in it. And the Bible teaches in Revelation chapter 20, verses 10 to 15, that at that great and awful day of the judgment, those whose names are not written in the book of life shall be cast in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which I understand to mean just as heaven is described in symbolic terms. Of course, heaven is not a literal wall made of jasper or gates of pearl or streets of gold. This is God's way of letting us know it's wonderful beyond our imagination to really grasp fully. But we can strive in that direction. And the description of hell is to let us know that to be separated from God and everything that's good is a terrible loss. It's to help us to know of the intensity of the suffering and to let us know that we've come face to face, that we now deserve what we have gotten. Punishment, to have any real effect, must have at its very bottom fundamental aspect retribution, even in our punishment of criminals. If they cannot come face to face with the realization that they have done wrong, that what's happening to them is what they deserve, we today, in recognizing what the Bible teaches, need to come to see that what we deserve if we live our lives in disobedience, as free men and women who can make up our mind whether we will or will not follow and serve God, that we will deserve what we will receive. Dr. Matson talked a moment ago about my book, Have Atheists Proved There Is No God? I intend to get into that in some detail in just a moment. But I want to say to you now that what he has been trying to say is that God, that I said in the book that if there is freedom, there must be sin. I said no such thing. I said if there is freedom, there must be the possibility of sin. And you cannot guarantee a free man that he will not sin. If you guarantee him that he will not sin, you are saying in effect that he is free and not free. But we live in this world free. Wallace Matson is free to come here. He's free to make up his own mind about the evidence for God, to reject God or not to reject him. But now I want to go into the details of the response, the biblical Christian response to the argument from evil, which is all he has talked about and all that he's had to say. It is the one and only argument that he has, and punishment is simply a phase of that. Let us look at chart 6U, the basic affirmation of theism in regard to the problem of evil. Dr. Matson, I invite you to address yourself to the book, Have Atheists Proved There Is No God? I will stand behind its basic teaching. That's what I'm going to be talking about now for a time. The basic affirmation of theism in the light of Bible teaching is this, in regard to response to your argument from evil. It is erroneous to conclude, as do atheists, that the existence of evil in this world, or for punishment after this life is over, it is false to conclude that this proves that God does not exist. This is the case because the concepts which are involved in the basic propositions of theism can be so interpreted and so explained or explicated as to avoid having to accept either a weakened version of theism, that is, a finite God, as some thinkers have done, or secondly, the view that the conjunction of the basic propositions of theism necessarily involves a logical contradiction. That I deny with all of my being, and I know that you know, if you can see anything, as Dr. Matson says, that he has not proved that to be the case. Let's look at the positive element of the basic affirmation of theism. Chart 36, U1A. Stated, the concepts involved in the basic propositions of Christian theism can be so interpreted and so explicated as to avoid having to accept the view that the conjunction of the basic propositions of theism necessarily involves a logical contradiction. It'll take something more than the mere assertions of Dr. Wallace Matson from Berkeley, California, to make that point stand. And I shall submit to you that there is no contradiction between any two or among more than two of these basic propositions. When the basic concepts of theism are understood, they are seen to be logically compatible with one another, but they do not, as the atheist alleges, involve a logical contradiction. The atheist cannot show that any of the propositions which are basic to theism contradict one another. Let's look at the bare bones of the atheistic argument on evil. When all is said and done and all the fancy talk has been done, here is what he says. If evil exists, including punishment, even a slap on the wrist for Hitler, if that exists, then God does not exist. He then says evil exists and concludes that God does not exist. I submit to you that the first proposition is false. The second is true, and the conclusion is false. Any proposition is unsound which has a false proposition, and this one does. Look now at the propositions which are pertinent to this problem. Now, understanding these will help you to understand the whole problem upon which Dr. Matson has based his case. I'm just going to read these, and then I want Dr. Matson to take them up and tell us which ones of these he believes is true and which one is not. Which ones contradict the other? Proposition W1, God is omnipotent. God is infinite in power. Proposition W2, God is perfect in goodness. Proposition W2A, God is omniscient. He is all-knowing. He knows all that is possible to know. Proposition W2B, God is perfect in justice. Proposition W3, evil exists. I admit that. I not only admit it, I insist that it's so. The Bible declares that it is. Proposition W3A, sin, that which contradicts man's sonship to God and his brotherhood to man, that which contradicts the will of God as revealed in the Scriptures, is the only intrinsic evil. It is not that there is a law above God, that God simply then, under that law, tells us what it must do, or what that law says. Nor is it the case that God arbitrarily says this or that. But God is ultimate goodness, and this goodness flows from the very nature of God. The kind of dilemma that the atheist poses for us is simply false. Proposition W3B, it is not evil that there is evil. Dr. Matson tried to make something of this a little moment ago. What I mean by that statement is this. It is not evil that God created and that he put a man and a woman on this earth with free will. When he formed man of the dust of the earth and gave him woman whom he had created to be his perfect companion and said, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. Notice, he's giving a choice. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Notice, God is the creator, and Dr. Matson has admitted that for all he knows, creation may have come out of nothing by an infinite being. Here is this infinite being who is saying, here is this instruction. He therefore makes clear they are free to obey him or not to obey him. He then warns them, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. But here we have not merely the devil's advocate, but a man who claims to be God in effect. Oh, no, God, you cannot do that. You will be evil if you say, if you will disobey me, you shall die. It is not evil that there is evil in the sense that it's not evil that God created the world, created man free, woman free, each of us to make up our own mind what we do, and therefore the situation that allows evil to occur, it is not evil that God has done it. Think of the presumption of this man to sit in judgment upon God. He needs to read the book of Job in the Old Testament where God warns men of what will be the result of such sort of action.